Will Kansas win two straight on the road? It's entirely possible. They can do it at Cincinnati. We preview KU Cincinnati coming up on Saturday.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on? Derek Johnson here at D Johnson Radio on Twitter. This is Locked On Jayhawks. Thank you for making it your first listen every day. Thank you to everydayers catching each and every show. And on today's edition of Locked On Jayhawks, we're going to be previewing Kansas and Cincinnati. We're going to get into the matchup, headlines, Cincinnati scouting report. We'll get into the matchups of the game and what players to watch on both sides of the ball. First, this episode of the show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. From big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel. New customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed, win or lose. Just visit FanDuel.com and you can get started today. So Kansas takes on Cincinnati. Saturday game taking place at 1 o'clock, I believe, Central Time. I think I gave the wrong time for the Arizona State game. I think it said 7 o'clock. I don't know. My head was a mess, apparently. I hope this one's right. Anyway, KU takes on Cincinnati, and the Bearcats are a team that's been reeling a little bit, whereas Kansas is trying to get momentum of their own. And I think that's the big headline coming into this game. Cincinnati coming off 3 straight losses, trying to get the ship righted. They're trying to go to their first NCAA tournament under their current head coach in Wes Miller, who's thought of as kind of an up-and-coming young head coach himself. And, they were obviously a very competitive team last year that I thought would have been good enough to make the NCAA tournament. But obviously, playing in a difficult Big 12, you end up with some extra losses in there. But I think they're going to be good enough to make the tournament this year, but obviously they have to stop the skid at some point here. For them, they're going to be thinking, oh, great, Saturday game against Kansas, trying to end a skid. Like, they're going to be fired up to play this game. You are going to get a good version of Cincinnati, not the same version that they've played as maybe in these last 3 games. Now, for Kansas, they've won 2 straight games. You're looking for 2 straight on the road. You're looking for 3 straight overall. And for a Kansas team that, I keep referring to these last 2 seasons as the Hunter Dickinson era, just because I feel like that's the most notable name. But Kansas is still, even after the last win at UCF, just 4-10 on the road in that era. So it's not as if the 51-point win at UCF, as nice as it was, all of a sudden makes it so that you are going to be expected to be this great road team. And this is the start of 2 straight on the road for you with this one and at Iowa State. And, it's not going to be easy for KU to, win either game. When you look at both Iowa State and Cincinnati, both are good teams. If you go 1-1 in this stretch, I think you're content with it. Obviously, it is Kansas basketball, so the high expectations are going to be go 2-0, right? But I think you'll be at least happy with 1-1. The problem is if you lose this first game with Cincinnati, like obviously if you said you can only win one of the 2, you would still take the at Iowa State because it would be an even bigger win. But if you have that happen where you lose the first game at Cincinnati and you're staring at 2-2 in Big 12 play with at Iowa State up next, you're not going to feel too great going into that game. So take care of business. Try to get this one done because that's a very, very important stretch upcoming right after that. Now, interestingly enough, this is the first meeting in Ohio since Cincinnati joined the Big 12. Last year they met in Allen Fieldhouse, the Johnny Furphy game, and they met in the Big 12 tournament. But they have played before many other times. Kansas is 4-5 all-time against Cincinnati. Obviously split last year. They went 2-0 in the Roy Williams era in the 90s against Cincinnati. Maybe the most famous game, I don't know if the youngins know about this one, Oscar Robertson had 43 points, all-time NBA great, Hall of Famer, etc. 43 points against Kansas in an NCAA tournament game. So, Oscar Robertson was very good. And now when you look at the Cincinnati scouting report, 10-4 on the season. They're a team that is receiving votes in both the AP and the Coaches Bowl. They're ranked just outside the top 30 on KenPom. They're just inside the top 40 on both Bart Torvik and the net ratings. They've lost 3 straight games, though, as kind of previously mentioned here, which I think, it's interesting. You look at the 10-1 start to the season, and they come in ranked in the top 20 and everything like that. I think it's a little easier now that they've lost 3 straight games to kind of look back on that and go, okay, well, what happened here? Are they not as good of a team? Are they going through something or what's going on here? Well, that 10-1 start, they did have 6 wins versus teams outside the top 200. They beat Dayton, who's probably an NCAA tournament team, pretty good team from the Atlantic 10 by 7. They beat Xavier, pretty good team from the Big East by 3. But both those are ranked around 50th nationally. So like solid teams. But it's not top 25 wins necessarily. When you look at for inside the top 100, losses that they've had, that's been the case so far. And, they had a top 45-ish Villanova team that beat them by 8. So I guess you can like reasonably look back to it and be like, well, how much of their hot start is just the schedule? Like, are they just a solid team, a bubble team, a decent team who had an easy schedule early on, and now they're in the Big 12? It's a little bit tougher. Again, are they just in a bad skid and they're going to turn it around? Those are questions that remain to be seen and where they go from here. But 3 straight losses came by 3 at Kansas State, which Kansas State's not very good this year, but I don't know. It's very hard to win on the road in college basketball. It's very hard to win on the road in the Big 12. They lost by 5 at home to Arizona, and then they lost by 20 on the road against Baylor. But again, I think you're going to get the best version of Cincinnati in this game. You look at the personnel of note for the Bearcats. They have a 6'3" guard, sophomore, I believe the son of Dajuan James, former Colts running back, Jizzle James. Great name. 11.1 points per game, 4.7 assists per game. He is not shooting great from 3, 29% from 3, 43% from the floor. But that just means you expect him to get like 3 threes against Kansas. They have a 6'6" guard in Dan Skillings. He had a really good game against Kansas in Allen Fieldhouse last year. He can really fill it up when he gets going. Over 13 points per game, 38% from 3. And that's really where I think you look at the kind of wing positions for Cincinnati. That's where they can really hurt you on the offensive end. So you have Skillings, who can score it in a lot of different ways. You have a couple guards in Day Thomas, who is shooting like 43% from 3. And then you have another wing in Simas Lukosius. It's not that all these guys start, but Lukosius at 6'8" is a shooter. He 13 points, over 3 assists per game. He's shooting almost 40% from 3 on high volume. He was super hit or miss in the 2 matchups with KU last year. In the Allen Fieldhouse loss for them, he couldn't hit anything. And then in the Big 12 tournament win over Kansas, he couldn't miss anything. Like, he was making everything in that game. So we'll see which version of him we get. But that's some really good shooters you have along the way there. They'll also play Connor Hickman about 20 minutes per game. He's really struggled shooting the ball so far this season. Then they have Dillon Mitchell, who normally in his career has struggled shooting. This year he's 33% from 3, but low volume, 6 of 18. But the best part about Dillon Mitchell, the former Texas Longhorn, former 5-star recruit, 6'8", hyper athletic wing. He's going for over 11 points, over 7 rebounds per game. And according to Evan Mia, he has been the second best defender, the second highest rated defender in the entirety of the Big 12 so far this season. So Dillon Mitchell, really good player. He can defend you one-on-one. He can be an help side defender because of that athleticism and pogo stick like jumping ability to block shots from the weak side. And he can really throw down dunks at a high level that create momentum changing plays. Then they have at center 7-foot Aziz Bandaogo, who is averaging 9.4 points per game. The rebound number's down from where they were last year, 5.7 per game. He's a good shot blocker, has been throughout his career, 1.9 blocks per game in about 25 minutes per game. He's shooting 70% from the floor. So when you look at it, their offensive with Dillon Mitchell and Aziz Bandaogo, that's not a ton of spacing. That's not a ton of like offensive creation for them between those two. It's a couple guys who can finish at the rim, who can dunk the basketball with authority, but are both good defenders on that end of the floor. So it becomes interesting how that will match up against Kansas. They also use 6'11", 240-pound Arinton Page for about 13 minutes a game. So you'll probably see him as well, in addition to a couple other players here or there. What they do well. This is a top 10 defense nationally, according to Ken Palm so far. They really run teams off the three-point line to this point in the year. They've held teams in check when they're shooting the threes, in addition to that, which makes sense. If you're consistently contesting threes, so they're not shooting as many, when they do shoot them, they're probably going to be tougher shots. They have a top 15 two-point defense. They have a top 50 block rate, right? Bandaogo and Mitchell have done a good job there. They haven't been sending teams to the free throw line a ton, so that's something, you do worry about sometimes. If you're a good blocking team, are you going to be too aggressive, right? And then you foul too much. That's not been the case. They've done a good job avoiding that, although that has changed in their 3 conference games. So we'll see what happens in this one. They have a solid defensive rebounding rate that's been actually better for them in Big 12 only games, which, very small sample size. They've been top 3 in the Big 12 there. And they have the 11th ranked effective field goal percentage defense nationally. Although that's a weird one because it's only been ninth. So they've in Big 12 only games. So they're 3 Big 12 games. They're middle of the pack in effective field goal percentage defense, but overall nationally they're 11th. So is that just a product of the schedule that we kind of talked about? Or did they just, play a couple teams that maybe got hot or something like that? They've also been one of the best transition defenses in the country. So that'll be interesting because Kansas has been a good transition offense. You look at the offensive side of the ball. This has been an elite offensive rebounding team, right? Like that's the positive, even though maybe they don't have a ton of offensive power from their 4-5 men, unless they're playing Lukosius at the 4, which they will do at certain times. But they have been an elite offensive rebounding team. They don't turn the ball over. So like they're a good possession team, though. Again, this is one of those things where in their 3 Big 12 games, they have been turning the ball over. They're top 80 in 2-point offense nationally, but again, in conference only games, they're bottom 4, and they don't really get the ball stolen or blocked. But again, it's hard to kind of parse out the numbers and be like, how much of that is schedule, right? You look at some of the Big 12 numbers, they're not as good, but it's also a small sample size. Now, when you look at where they've struggled, this is one of the lowest free throw rates offensively in the country, though ironically, they're still like right around where Kansas is. Shooting free throws horribly when they get there, just 62.8% at the foul line. So do keep that in mind. If this is a close game late, if Kansas ends up being down late and you have to foul them, on paper, they have not been a good free throw shooting team so far this season. And then in Big 12 games, they've just kind of struggled shooting at every level and have turned it over too much. All right, let's get to our matchups of the game, players to watch. This is Locked On Jayhawks. And our episode of Locked On Jayhawks is brought to you by TurboTax. This is a message from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. Are you tired of the endless waiting, wondering, and worrying about your taxes? Well, now that's a thing of the past. You see, taxes don't need to be complicated or stressful. TurboTax is here to change the game by matching you with a TurboTax expert who can get to work on your return right away. No more waiting for answers. No more wondering if you're missing out on deductions. Whether you've got one form or 20, TurboTax experts gives your taxes their undivided attention, while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on what really matters. You won't have to lift a finger, but you'll get the peace of mind knowing that your taxes are being handled by the pros. Ready for stress-free taxes and the most money back guaranteed? Head over to TurboTax.com today and get matched with your expert who's ready to take your taxes off your plate so you can focus on your day. Only available with TurboTax Live Full Service. Real-time updates only in the iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. Onto our matchups of the game, then we'll get to our players to watch for Kansas Cincinnati on Saturday. Don't forget to check out Locked On College Football for recaps or previews, talking about all the college football playoff. Locked On College Basketball gets you ready for the weekend ahead in college hoops as well. All right, top matchups of the game. Number 1 is rebounding. Cincinnati is in the 95th percentile nationally in offensive rebound rate. They crash the offensive glass. They're good at it. They're also solid on the defensive end, 71st percentile nationally, but the offensive rebound is really where they get you. And that's typically the trait of tough teams in the case of Cincinnati. It's sometimes also the case of teams that aren't great shooting teams where it's like, we have to do this. Like, I think back to some of those West Virginia, Bob Huggins, press Virginia teams. They forced turnovers and they weren't great shooting teams, even though they usually would have like a guard or two who were good shooters or good scorers. But they just rebounded the crap out of the ball. Cincinnati is a very good rebounding team. Kansas has to come ready to battle, right? If you come out with the lack of energy, which we've seen Kansas do in some wins, we've seen them do in some losses where maybe in the first half they come out with that lack of energy, you're going to get punked on the boards in this game. You have to come ready to play mentally to get you ready to play physically, because this is going to be a physical game inside. You have to box them out. You have to prevent them from dominating on the glass. Cincinnati's in the 91st percentile in second chance points per game. And because this is an identity and a strength for Cincinnati, you're not going to just totally limit them from getting on the offensive glass, but can you hold them to one of their, lower numbers of the season? And can you get some offensive rebounds yourself to get extra possessions on your end? And if you can hold your own and get some offensive boards yourself to try and limit, what typically is the Cincinnati strength and more neutralize it, I think you'll be in good shape. And here's the proof. All 4 of Cincinnati's losses this season are to teams who rank top 100 in offensive rebounding rate on the season. The bad news for KU is that they don't. They rank outside the top 100 in offensive rebounding rate. But the good news is that they've been much better, has Kansas, since the Creighton game in terms of offensive rebounding, right? and you look at it on the season, I'm trying to see what they had in the Arizona State game. So yeah, in the Arizona State game, they had their second best offensive rebounding game of the season. The UCF game, they had their best offensive rebounding game of the season. So that's your last two games. You had your best offensive rebounding games. The Missouri game was your third best, even though you lost the game. The NC State game was your fourth best by offensive rebound percentage. That means what? If you're talking about NC State, Missouri, so what? 4 of your last 5 games, you have had 4 of your best offensive rebounding games of the season. So even though Kansas overall in the season doesn't rank great on offensive rebounding, they're showing progress there. They're getting a lot better, and that has to make you feel a little bit better about this matchup. Number 2, can you space the floor and score against a team who plays good defense and has legit shot blockers, but really the main shot blocker in Aziz Bandaogo? Are they going to sag in the paint against KJ Adams? And for a team with a good defense already in Cincinnati, is that going to be a death nail for KU if they do? Plus, Cincinnati already has that good interior defense. They're in the 84th percentile for preventing paint points so far this season. Teams are shooting just 56.5% at the rim against them. But, Kansas is still going to need to find a way to score inside to be an efficient offense, I think both in general and just kind of how they want to play. Like, they want to be a team, even if they're playing a team who has good shot blockers, they're not going to stray away from their identity. They're still going to go inside and try to get points there. And all 4 of Cincinnati's losses have been their worst 4 defensive games by points allowed per possession. All 4 of their losses, they've given up 102 points per 100 possessions or more. And all of their wins, they've held teams to 97 or below for points per 100 possessions. So there's a gap there. You have to find a way to be an efficient enough offense against a good defense. And, Kansas, the good news, they've only been held to 97 or less points per 100 possessions twice this season. Bad news, both those were losses to Missouri and Creighton, teams who were on the road where they condensed the paint. So we'll see what happens here against Cincinnati, but can you find some easy buckets? Then number 3 is hitting from the mid-range for Kansas. This is not an ideal way to play offense in, I think, today's day and age of just basketball in general, analytically inclined, right? Like, to give you an idea, Kansas actually ranks in the 81st percentile nationally right now in mid-range two-pointers. They're shooting 41% on mid-range two. So that's, one of the top 5th, I guess you would say, percentages in the country. But even then, that means it's 41%, which is one of the better numbers. So think about it this way. A 3-pointer is worth 1.5 times what a 2-point shot is worth, right? This is basic math. So theoretically, if you shoot 50% on 2-point shots, that is the equivalent of shooting 33% on 3-point shots, right? You take 3 3-pointers, you make 1 of them on average. That's worth 3 points. You take 6 3-pointers, you make 2 of them on average. That would be 2 of 6, 33%. That's 6 points. What's the equivalent to that, right? 6 2-point attempts. If you make 50%, that's 3 of 6. That's also 6 points. So 50% equals 33% in that math game. That means you have to shoot 50% on 2s, right, to equal 33% on 3s, which is the national average. So if you're shooting 41% on mid-range shots, which is actually a good percentage, then the 3-point equivalent is what, like 27%, something like that. So, that's why people go away from mid-range. Now, there's still the art of the game where it's like, but if you completely stop taking them, then you become more predictable in how teams defend you, right? And if you still get a wide open mid-range shot, those shots are going to go in at a higher clip than 41%. So that didn't mean to get too much into the weeds of like the analytics of this stuff. But the fact of the matter is Cincinnati does a good job at the rim. They do a good job chasing you off the 3-point line. And opponents, 16% of opponents' shot attempts against the Bearcats in conference-only games have come from the mid-range. The national average there is 11%. So you can see that teams have to take typically more mid-range shots against Cincinnati than the national average, right? And so there is good news there for KU in that they are shooting, much better than the national average in terms of their mid-range 2-point percentage, which, by the way, did you know Dajuan Harris is shooting 70% in the mid-range so far this season? So congrats to him. Maybe he'll be part of the players to watch. Maybe not. Let's find out next. This is Locked on Jayhawks. This episode of the show is brought to you by FanDuel. From big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. The FanDuel app gives you everything you need for live bets, same game parlays, and so much more. You can bet on Kansas against Cincinnati. You can bet on the Chiefs, a future to win the Super Bowl. You can bet on the Kansas Jayhawks when those numbers come out during the offseason for their over-under win total. You can get the Jayhawks on the basketball court to still win the Big 12 at plus odds. They're not the favorite right now when you have Iowa State and Houston in the conference. You can do all those at FanDuel. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $200 in bonus bets. That is FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL and the Locked On Podcast Network. Finishing things up on this episode of the show with players to watch for the Jayhawks against the Cincinnati Bearcats. Again, game on Saturday. We'll have a recap for you out this weekend also. And then next week, we'll be talking more KU basketball as we get you ready for the Iowa State game. That'll be a big one on Wednesday. But we'll also talk a little KU football with some of the strengths and biggest questions remaining for KU football as their transfer portal season kind of coming to a close here before the start of the second semester and before the start of spring football and everything here. So as far as our player matchup for Kansas and Cincinnati, I think there's certainly a couple interesting ones. I find the one between Bandaogo and Hunter Dickinson very interesting because you have this guy in Bandaogo who's a really good defender on the interior. And Hunter Dickinson was held pretty much in check in the Lawrence meeting and obviously didn't play in the Big 12 tournament meeting between these two. So I think that'll be a very interesting one. I also think the battle on the wing is going to be super interesting, right? If Cincinnati's playing their big lineup, you would call it, with Dillon Mitchell at the 4 and Simas Lukosius, who's 6'8" at the 3 and 6'6" Dan Skillings at the 2. Just in general, like, how does Shakeel Moore guard a 6'6" Dan Skillings? How does a Zeke Mayo guard a 6'8" Simas Lukosius? If those are potentially the matchups. But I am going to go with KJ Adams versus Dillon Mitchell because I think there's, a lot of maybe like similarities, you would say, in this matchup here. Like, these are two guys who are, athletic wings who they don't always score the most points, but it's like when they do, a lot of them are like these very energetic, crowd-changing dunks. They're both guys who are seen as very good defenders. They're both guys who, I think in the case of Dillon Mitchell, he has a little bit more shooting. He has a little bit more offensive pop, a little bit more ability to drive in his game, whereas with KJ, I think you have a little bit more passing in his game. Obviously, Mitchell's the better rebounder of the two as well, although KJ's rebounding has been definitely better over the last 2 games. So we'll see if that's a trend that can continue because that would be a game changer for both him and for Kansas. But they're both players that, make a lot of winning plays, do a lot of winning things, but also, certainly can at times lead to offensive spacing issues for both teams. So how do both coaches work around that? How do both coaches work to that on the defensive end of the court? We saw when Kansas felt comfortable leaving basically a player open in Cincinnati Harris in the West Virginia matchup, that they were just like, let's throw Flory out there and have him be a rover and a defender in that way. So maybe we even put Flory / KJ versus Dillon Mitchell because maybe that's something they do. And they just say, hey, we're just going to rove off of Dillon Mitchell with Flory when he's in there and just let him be a game wrecker on the defensive end. So I think that'll be a very interesting matchup at both ends of the court because I think there's certainly some similarities there. All right, that'll do it for this episode of the show with Locked On Jayhawks. You can find our show anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page. We'll be back for a KU Cincinnati recap this weekend. See you then with LOJ.